Delighted to be here today, welcoming you to this conference. I'm down somewhat disingenuously as a keynote speaker. Let me tell you right now, that isn't going to happen. I am not the keynote speaker today. I've got a very easy job. I'm going to talk you through what impact is, why it's important. I'm going to give you some clues about how to capture it. But my main thing that I'm excited about today is that you've got three of the best possible speakers throughout the day that you could imagine. Dr. Arimma Ochu, just like to give big props to Arimma. She's been a long-standing part of my career in impact and engagement. She led the culture change at the Manchester Beacon project. She's a Wellcome Trust Engagement Fellow. You're going to hear from her later, and it's going to be fantastic. We've also got later on Professor Rebecca Lawtham, who knows everything that you need to know about co-creation and working collaboratively with community partners. And following me, in roughly about 7 minutes, we're going to have Professor Kathy Parker, who's going to talk you through a live ESRC funded project that is having huge impact right now. Okay, so impact. How many of you know what impact is in a university sense? Quick straw poll, hands up. How many of you feel confident? Okay, there's a few hands there. This is how impact is defined in universities. And I think what's interesting to look at here is this notion of it being beyond academia. So quite a lot of people get sometimes confused between academic impact through citations, bibliometrics, etc., and what I call economic and social impact, which is what we're talking about today. And this is the notion of impact beyond the university walls. The other features of this that are important is this measurement by reach. So how many people has the impact affected, and then significance, and how deeply has that effect been felt. And it's the significance bit which tends to cause universities the problem. Impact is a broad church. So lots of people automatically think of economic impacts, economic and commercial impacts. But just to let you know, I know we'll have a variety of disciplines in the audience today, that there are also impacts on culture and society, health and well-being, environmental impacts, public policy and services, etc. So whatever discipline your research is in, you can align it to an impact area very successfully. I think this is a crucial point as well. Engagement is critical for impact. You're not going to have impact if you sit in your lab or sit in your office and you don't think about the end users that you're working with or that your research could possibly benefit. So whilst you can do lots of engagement without impact, I don't believe you can have impact without engagement. And maybe that's something that people in this audience don't necessarily agree with, and we can talk about that through the day. But that's my contention. And when we look at engagement and impact, I think it's important to delineate the differences between the two. So for me, engagement, public engagement, knowledge exchange, that's a conversation, and impact is what changes as a result of that conversation. Okay? So one of the examples people used a lot when they were looking at impact to start with was people like Brian Cox. And that's fantastic. You can be on television, you can have huge reach, get into the living rooms of millions of people on primetime BBC. But what's difficult about that is quantifying what change or benefit or effect Brian Cox being on television has on people. Okay, so engagement, conversation, impact, what changes as a result of that. Where has impact come from? I'm just going to talk you through very quickly the evolution of impact in the research landscape. In about 2009, the research councils started to require researchers in all of their grant applications to put in impact plans. And that's evolved into the Pathways to Impact agenda, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So now any research grant to a UK research funder has to include this notion of impact, and it asks you to predict what types of impact you're going to have and work studies. And that accounts for 20% of the score in the ref. when I worked out what pathways to impact, Horizon 2020, and represented on an annual basis in monetary terms, I think I came to the figure of around £16 billion annually is now available for impact. So it really is a massive deal. Why is impact important? Okay. I'm always minded to go back to the words of the great Bob Dylan. We live in interesting times. Everything is changing extremely rapidly, and that's very true for universities and researchers, but it's also extremely true for society. If you think about WikiLeaks, age of austerity, banking crisis, MPs' expenses, etc., I think what you're left with is this sense that people expect more of their institutions. We mustn't lose sight of the fact that universities are charities. They are funded through the public purse. All of the taxpayers in the UK pay for research. So we need to be accountable for what benefits to society that research is having. And that's where the impact agenda is coming from. It's all about trying to demonstrate a return on investment for research. That's why it's important kind of nationally for the government and for society. But it also obviously has huge benefits to universities too. I was responsible for my sins for the university's submission to our last REF, the Research Excellence Framework. And in doing that, we had to grapple with this notion of impact and come up with these case studies. You've got a copy of this publication in all of your packs, this Research Matters. But it's great, actually, to be able to say that MMU's research underpins EU pledges on climate change and carbon emissions. It's great to say that it helps to save lives through the rapid diagnosis of deadly microbial infections. Our research underpins 2 of the 10 protected characteristics in the Single Equality Scheme. Every education and young person's professional worker in the UK has been positively affected by MMU's research through the early years framework and the early years curriculum, etc., etc. So you can see, actually, yes, it's a pain trying to gather all this data together on impact. Yes, it's hard, but what it gives us is some fantastic information in terms of the quality of our research and what benefits it's had. And I think it's really important that our students, our staff, our alumni, and the partners that we have in the local and regional community understand what it is that we are offering and what benefits that research can have. And obviously there are some personal benefits to you guys as well. So the people that I work with, the researchers that I work with the most on this agenda, who, by the way, I consider to be the best researchers as well, the ones that are the most engaging, the ones that have the most impact. It allows them to reconnect with why they got involved in science or arts and humanities, social sciences in the first place. You know, they came into this to try and make a difference to the world. And that's a very, very powerful motivator. It allows them to shape the debate in their discipline. It's undoubtedly going to lead to more success in grant bids and funding proposals. If you're interested in this kind of thing, you can build your public profile. And obviously you can have career success. But for me, the most powerful motivator is the thing I said at the start there. People do this because it aligns with their values and their passions. Obviously as well, equally important, there are benefits to our partners. You know, this agenda builds trust. It helps them to build capacity. They can take an evidence-based approach through the work that they do with universities. So it's important to us, and it's also important to the people we work with. This is just to illustrate, these are some of the champions that I've worked with over the last kind of 10 years really. And you might recognise some of those as supervisors. You've got Joe Verron there at the bottom, Professor of Microbiology, but also now Head of Science Communication in the Faculty of Science and Engineering, but also producing lots of fantastic, impactful research. If you look at Man Met Life in MMU this week, you'll see that the Science Festival that we've just been engaged with has been a huge success this year. So there's lots of great champions that are really pushing this agenda. Okay, one of the hard things around impact is capturing it and evidencing it. And this is something that university research managers like myself have been struggling with and grappling with over the last year or so. And actually, I'm glad that Arinma's here, because in some ways I have her to thank for this approach. So when we were in the Beacon, we started to think about, well, how do you make sure that you work in a way that has the impact that you're trying to have embedded from the outset? And Arinma, I'm sure, will remember one of the tools that we used was called the logic model, based on a theory of change methodology for you social scientists out there. And essentially, it's a way of getting people to think about what impact they want to have at the outset. So this shows a live project. This is from MMU's Gothic literature researchers. And we sit down with them and we try and work out what is the aim that their research is trying to have. And after many cups of coffee and lots of brains being racked, we came up with the stuff at the top here, which you can see better like this. The goal is to make MMU and Manchester the recognised home of goth in the UK. Now, any of you who knows goth culture will realise that Whitby is currently the home of goth in the UK. And so MMU and Manchester's got to go some distance in the next 5 years to knock Whitby off its perch. And we start to think about, well, if that's going to be the goal, what are the impacts that will be realised through that? And you start to think, well, okay, there'll be economic impacts as more tourism is attracted to the city to see all this goth stuff. The city will have to change the way it markets itself to goths. So there'll be policy impacts in the way that the city operates. There'll be civil society impacts as goth culture is raised and accepted more. There'll be cultural impacts through things like the Gothic Manchester Festival. And what we do is we start with those kind of impacts that we're aiming for, and we build a set of indicators and evidence base around that. We start to look at, if those are the impacts that you're trying to have, what would be the types of evidence that you'd need to collect now in order to demonstrate the effectiveness of those impacts. So you see there's things like audience figures, there's things like economic data around tourism, there's things like the type of audiences, testimony, reviews for events, etc., etc. I'm not going to labour this point too much, and we can send round the slides so you can have a look at it in more detail. You work backwards still, and you look at, okay, if those are the impacts that we're trying to have, and that's the set of evidence that we're trying to gather, what needs to happen between now and then in order to make that happen? Okay? And the key piece of the key realisation for these researchers was that, and you can see a bit of the way down on here, there's this International Gothic Association conference which was scheduled to take place in the UK in either 2016 or 2017. Now, sitting down with those researchers, they realised that if that conference takes place in the UK but doesn't take place in Manchester in 2016, 2017, takes place, I don't know, in Brighton or, God forbid, Whitby, then they can never realise that aim of making Manchester the recognised home of the goth. So it led to them thinking about, well, what do we need to do to make this happen? We need to engage with Marketing Manchester. We need to have a conversation right now with our head of department about freeing up the workload to make a convincing case to host this conference in Manchester. So you can kind of see how this approach can help you to articulate the impact you're trying to have, but also help you to spot the gaps in your planning. And you can use this not just for impact, but for career planning, etc., etc. And when you work backwards still, you look at the activities that you're presently delivering. And we've got, I mean, I'm not going to dwell on this, we've got a whole of types of evidence for each impact domain, indicators that go along with that evidence. But basically, the point I'm trying to make is, whatever discipline you are in, there is some impact out there for you. And there are types of evidence that people recognise that underpin that impact. And if you're interested in toolkits around that, then please just contact me through Christine afterwards, and I'll let you see that information for your specific discipline. Another way of capturing impact, and I decided to slide this in today at the last minute, is obviously some of you may be familiar with Altmetrics and social media. And what I think is interesting about this is that social media isn't just about broadcasting, it can also be about capturing, because essentially what you're doing is archiving digital content. So this slide is taken from the university's research information management system called Symplectic, and it shows here that this paper by Alex Ireland has been picked up by one news outlet, blogged by one, tweeted by 10. So you can start to track the kind of social impact of your research. Again, more kind of information that you can get from Altmetrics. If you're not using social media or not engaged with Altmetrics, I would encourage you just have a quick look at it and see, because it's interesting to see who's tweeting about your work, who's talking about it, which end users are engaged with your research. And also here you can see there's this geographical spread, and it also tells you the demographics, so how many people are members of the public, scientists, etc., etc. There are significant challenges with impact. Let's make no bones about it. Broadcast models are still prevalent, so that thing about Brian Cox doing one-way engagement, that's still the norm for many people. There are different perspectives on it. Researchers do feel like it's yet another thing they have to do on top of everything else. Capturing evidence is hard. In some disciplines like healthcare sciences, it can take 20 years to develop an impact. You can be working on something now that's going to take 20, 25, 30 years to actually be realized as a product. And that really brings me to the end of my section of this talk.